So as we can see, using pivot tables allows us to create really organized and sophisticated table form reports. But another neat feature that comes with pivot tables is pivot charts. So not only can we see our data in table form, but we can present our data in chart form as well. So to insert a pivot chart, we can select any cell within our pivot table, then come up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and then select Pivot Chart. And then from here, we can select any chart that we want, but for this example, I'm just going to use the clustered column chart. So if we click OK, now we have inserted our pivot chart. Now the difference between pivot charts and regular charts that we have worked with earlier in the course is that if we change anything in our fields window, it will not only update our pivot table, but it will update our chart as well. And vice versa. Anything we change in our pivot chart using these filter buttons, it will update our pivot table as well. So our pivot table and our pivot chart are always connected. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say in this column chart, we want to have the different product IDs on the x-axis, and then show the amount of total sales for each product. So if we come over here to our fields window, we can select the month and drag that out. And then to get the product ID on the x-axis, we can move the product ID out of legend and move it to axis. So now our chart shows the total sales for each product ID. And the same goes for our pivot table. So both our pivot table and pivot chart updated. Now let's mess around with our different fields and see what ways we can view our data in chart form. So let's say that we wanted to see the total sales for each product by region. Well, all we have to do is select our region field and drag it down to our legend. And this added the legend to our chart that includes the regions, and then it also added the regions to our column labels in our pivot table. Now let's try to get our chart to show the total sales for each product for each quarter. So we can deselect region, and then select the month, move our product ID to the legend, and then we need to group our months by quarter. And to do that, we need to select a month in the row labels, give it a right click, and select Group. And then we can select Quarters and click OK. Now we can see the total sales for each product by quarter. And if we wanted to apply filters to this chart, we can either apply a filter to the product ID or the quarters. For example, if I click this drop down, I can select which quarters I want to filter. So let's say we only want to see quarter 1 and 2. We can select those and click OK. And if we want to apply a filter to the product ID, we can select its filter button and then select the products that we want to show in our chart. Now our chart is showing the total sales for product A101 and B102 for quarters 1 and 2. And by applying these filters to our chart, it also applied the filters to our pivot table. And if I change the filters in our pivot table, it will do the same for our pivot chart. So that's one option we could use to filter data inside of our pivot table and pivot chart. Another option is to use slicers. Now before we insert a slicer, I do want to mention that slicers are only available for Excel 2016 and newer. And slicers can be located underneath the Pivot Table Analyze tab. And then we can select Insert Slicer. And then from here, we can select which slicers to insert. So if we want to have an option to filter by region, we can select region. And if we want to filter by the month, we can select month. And if we click OK, now Excel has inserted these slicers. So slicers allows us to easily filter data inside of our pivot table or pivot chart. For example, in our chart, on the x-axis, we have the quarters, and then we have the product IDs in the legend. So the month or a region is currently not in the chart or the pivot table, but we can still filter by the month and region because that data is still resting in our source. So for example, let's say I only want to see the total sales for the North region. I can click North, and now our table and chart only shows the data for the North region. And if I want to select multiple regions, I can click the Control key or the Command key if you're on Mac and select another region. So let's say that we want to see the North and South region. Now we're only seeing the data for those two regions. Another neat thing with slicers is that we can apply multiple filters at the same time. Right now we're seeing the data for the North and South region, but for all the months. So in our month slicer, we can select which months that we want to show in our chart. So let's say that we want to show January, and I can press the Control key or the Command key to select more months. So let's just select February and March. Now our table and chart only show data for the month of January, February, March for the North and South regions. And the reason why our chart only shows quarter one is because we only have January, February, and March selected, and all the other months are filtered out. So if we add April, May, and June, now it's showing quarter one and quarter two. And to clear these filters, all we have to do is click on the red X at the top right-hand corner of the slicer. And this will clear the filters. Slicers also come with a lot of formatting options as well. We can resize these slicers by clicking and dragging one of the endpoints. And underneath the Slicers tab, we can apply different styles to these slicers as well by clicking this drop down underneath Styles and then select the style that you prefer. So let's say that we want a dark blue color instead of a light blue. It's totally up to you. So that's how we can view our data in our pivot table in chart form. And within our chart, we can use the filter buttons or add slicers to filter our data. And whatever changes we make to the pivot table or the pivot chart, they will always be connected to each other, making our spreadsheets more dynamic.